Okay, we're on. All right, well, welcome, and as we coming up upon is this Christmas week coming up? The 15th? No, the next week. Week and a half. Okay. I lose track. Tried to look at the calendar this morning. Well, sure. Oh, yeah. There's always been things. Well, as we were talking last week, we've been examining within understanding how there's the black churches and basically kind of the white churches, and we've been looking at our fellowship. I assume there's probably a lot of similarity within others, and so we were looking at Marshall Keeble, and we're looking at these two different ways of dealing with this, this segregated way of doing things. And one was called the accommodationist approach, and then there was the other that wasn't accepting that, which we'll hopefully get to start on today. And so we're looking at Marshall Keeble. And Marshall Keeble was a very significant figure. We talked about him last week quite a bit. And he was one that kind of fell in line, if we will. Kind of knew, quote, apparently knew his place. So he was praised all the time by many in our fellowship and so on, because he didn't fight against all this that was going on, even though he was aware and knew this. And of course, his reasons were he got his funding from white congregations, white benefactors, and he didn't want to lose that because he felt preaching the gospel and so on was important and the different things. And so that was kind of one approach, though he was keenly aware of the way things were. And so as we were looking at that, we ended up with looking at Foye Wallace and kind of his view of things, and so as we continue on, Dwayne Winrow, a Keeble understudy for several years, claimed that although Keeble advocated for blacks and adapted life philosophy similar to that of Booker T. Washington, he should not be mistaken to have been an Uncle Tom, if you will, for whites. Some of us who knew him and traveled with him often characterized him as a preacher ahead of his time. And we saw him as a black preacher who was able to communicate effectively across racial lines. And as we said, he reached thousands and thousands in his lifetime. The Keeble style of wit and logic, coupled with straightforwardness and skillful expression, enabled him to say things to white audiences that would have required a great deal of courage from other black preachers in his day. And one finds that Marshall Keeble was a man who exploited the prevailing racial system in order to preach the gospel to as wide an audience as possible. Recent scholarship has highlighted some instances of Keeble's subtle protest that subverted the Jim Crow norms that were going on behind the scenes, complicating the traditional picture of Keeble as a strict accommodationist. For example, he often baptized white people and was at times threatened or even attacked for doing so. In other words, these were difficult times, and so he would often do some of that anyway, though that was very much frowned upon. Furthermore, Keeble's decision to endure right racism within the church was motivated by his desire to retain white support to fund black churches and the Nashville Christian Institute that educated black preachers. When asked by Floyd Rose why he did not tell white people that segregation was wrong, Keeble responded, "If I tell them, I hate this as much as you do, but if I tell them, what's going to happen to the school?" Now, NCI, and we're going to talk more about this, as you know, they wouldn't let blacks into our colleges and universities. where the training was, and that was not uncommon in places, as we well know. And so to train their own, they formed this institution. And it was very significant for about 40 years, 30, 40 years. And this was in Nashville. And so this was going to influence and train numerous people. And so here's a picture, I think, of their old building and structure. Now, this was nothing fancy. They just barely kind of squeaked by, and they were, and so very, very significant. So this was so important to him that he was willing to endure a lot of these attitudes. And so Wes Crawford, a scholar and historian in our fellowship, also argues that Keble sometimes urged protest behind the scenes, at least by the 60s. John Mark Tucker heard Keble in a chapel at NCI in 1964 likened Democratic presidential candidate Lyndon Baines Johnson to Moses, who had helped set the people free because of his support for civil rights. And so here they're latching on to these legislative things and so on because of the good that it would that they perceived that it would do. And again, think about that in the context of a people who have nothing to do with the world. Don't involve yourself in the world, and so on and so forth. And yet, and we're going to talk more about this, yet latching on to some of these things to try to improve those conditions, even with that kind of background. Furthermore, strong condemnation from the white NCI president. Keble told NCI students to join a civil rights march that they felt it was the right thing to do. In 1965, Keble celebrated former President John Kennedy to friends, giving him credit for civil rights gains. And so the point is that this publicly acknowledging or embracing the political realm, if you will, as a people that at one time have nothing to do with that. And so why? Trying to correct these wrongs. Now, one thing about NCI that's important to realize, that even though it was an institution to train black preachers, money was, much of the money, at least initially, was coming from white supporters like A.M. Burton and others who we'll talk about. And so the way things were, even though it was their school, there was those that had the authority and in charge, the board, if you will, running it and so on, they weren't black. They were white. Or at least some were. And so that's what that reference is. And so it was the way things were. Like his childhood idol, Booker T. Washington, Keble quickly declared accommodation while privately taking a more subversive route at times. Perhaps Keble's most influential work for civil rights was in educating some of the most influential activists in Churches of Christ and even in America, including Fred Gray, Molifi Kente Asante, if I may have said that wrong, Floyd Rose, and Franklin Florence. Now, I don't know how much we read the chronicles of the different things and are aware, but Fred Gray was a particularly influential and well-known figure in the civil rights movement, and he's a elder and preacher in the Churches of Christ also. And in recent times, the last 10 years or so, maybe a little more than that, the schools like Lipscomb and I assume Harding and others have been bestowing upon him degrees and honorary degrees in recognition for all his work, where at one time they fought against him and wouldn't let him in. And when we were at a summer celebration down at Lipscomb 3-4 years ago, 5, whatever it is, they were featuring him and honoring him and so on in that particular event weekend. And so anyhow, found that very interesting. He was Martin Luther King's lawyer. He represented Rosa Parks and so on and so forth. So a very influential figure in the history of those things, as were these others, but lesser known. Now, if Keble represented the public accommodationist tradition that usually chose not to address racism from the pulpit or with the pen, G.P. Bowser, George Philip Bowser, provided early leadership for this tradition, what the academics are calling the protest tradition. Bowser provided early leadership for this tradition, which was fully capable of launching vigorous critiques against white racism in church and working to establish independent black networks. The protest tradition was motivated by self-help ideology that centered on racial self-determination or the idea that black people should run their own institutions and speak for themselves. And so, we want to say in this was basically the point. And so there were those that were not going to do like Marshall Keble and accept much of that for the support. They're saying if that's the way it is, and again, you got to realize that it wasn't necessarily all accommodationist or all protest. Usually there's kind of a little bit more of this and that and so on, depending on the situation. For this reason, one could call this independent tradition, as leaders in this tradition helped to found institutions and networks that provided the means for black churches of Christ to develop independently from the white counterparts. At the same time, many of these leaders were connected to Keble and NCI, the training school. Therefore, protest and accommodation reflect different philosophies about resisting racism within the church and society, but people in both approaches moved along a continuum from accommodation to protest as they worked in complex contexts to build out what would become black churches of Christ. Now, Bowser was born in Alabama but raised in Nashville, and he was reared as a Methodist and educated at a Methodist college. Okay, so a little bit different there. The one-eyed, one-armed preaching wonder. In other words, he lost eyesight. I don't know if he was born with it or not, and was missing an arm, and I don't know the particulars on how that came about or if he was born that way. I don't know. But he had a good working knowledge both of the biblical text and original biblical languages. He also paid attention to the broader movement for African American civil rights and black pride. For example, he prayed for the success of Marcus Garvey's movement for black independence, and he supported the NAACP, excuse me. I really blew that one. And so these were organizations, the NAACP, which was formed, I think, early in the 20th century, I think. I didn't go back and get all my, but anyhow, so, and of course, what were these organizations? These were organizations to help change the way these things were. These were organizations that were separate and apart, if you will, from the church. Not that there weren't a lot of church people in them, but nonetheless. And so he was very supportive of those to change. And Marcus Garvey was a figure that I think his movement was called the Back to Africa movement, I believe. And interesting character, and that was in the early 20th century, I think, also, if I remember. So anyhow, Bowser was both a teacher and a preacher and an educator who founded and directed several schools for black preachers. In 1907, he established a school in Nashville. 2 years later, it moved to Silver Point, Tennessee, and was renamed Silver Point Christian Institute. In 1938, Bowser began another school, the Bowser Christian Institute, and it operated out of his home in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So he was an experienced educator where he was at. And I've seen, I may have later on, a picture of the Silver Point Christian Institute. I mean, it's not this sprawling campus. It's basically a building. Where it's, and I think that's in Tennessee, I think that's in Tennessee. But anyhow, so just to realize the accommodations. There, he trained corps of men who would provide leadership for black churches in years to come. Notably, of this group were J.S. Winston, R.N. Hogan, Levi Kennedy, and G.E. Stewart. Now, these are names that probably every one of us, or if not most, never heard, yet these were very significant figures within the black churches of Christ. These leaders built institutions and networks and fostered a thriving black churches of Christ tradition by the middle of the 20th century. By the late 1940s, most of the more than 170 black Church of Christ preachers had been mentored by Keeble or Bowser. And so, two very influential men. Now, Bowser fostered a tradition that spurned white support when whites insisted on racist behavior and practice. For example, A.M. Burton. Now, he's a very significant figure in Nashville, and he ran, it was an insurance company, and I got the name a little bit later. I don't remember exactly what it was. And so he, for many, many decades, helped to provide money and support for Keeble and these institutions. And so he founded in 1920 the Southern Practical Institute. So this was one of those early attempts at a school for black students in Nashville. Okay, now realize what was, you had the schools, and they were segregated, and the black schools were in terrible shape, not well funded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're trying to get an education, and so they're trying to support and provide this alternative, if you will, to the system and the way things are. And so what happened was they invited Bowser to serve as principal under the white superintendent, whose name was C.E.W. Doris. And something terrible happened. And again, it was kind of the way things were, was that Doris insisted that the black students conform to the Southern custom and enter the school through the back door. This is their school, and you're supposed to go through the back door, because that was the way things were. Bill? For black students. Well, I think it shows how strong and pervasive a lot of the attitudes and the customs were of down there. And why is that? Because where was the support coming from? All the white supporters, because they had money. And so you don't want to upset them. Kind of a sad joke, isn't it? Yeah. Well, yeah, something that was making fun of a thing at the times. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Down there meaning Harding, right? Yeah. He didn't say that. He didn't say that. He didn't say that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Well, again, again, it's just illustrating how powerful and persuasive that culture is that we're in, and we're often influenced. Now, that's not to say that everybody in these areas all thought to those extents, weren't bothered by it, thought something was wrong, things like that. That doesn't mean that that isn't the case. But very true. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and at times, when you're living in those times, you don't always realize all that's involved with that and the issues. Whereas, uh, I'm I'm thankful we're in these times and on this side of so much of that. Some would say that, yeah, and that that I'm not saying that's not so. And again, people's experiences are different. So as you've pointed out many times, Joe, that while it may not, well, we weren't even aware of that. That wasn't an issue down here. Yeah, and that's what Betty was sharing about down there in Deloge, and so on. So again, the point is these things were very real, and that they influence these things that are happening and going to happen, and in some minds even today, and and the thing is, it just shows how challenging and difficult that is wherever. Go and change yourself and work to. And so anyhow, so we see how complex all this is. Now, though, Bill, sure. Hmm. The mention was that he was the president that signed the Civil Rights Act, and so that was why. And we didn't go into high detail on that, but the point is, and you can see why. Wow, here's a chance for things to be different, where these laws won't be in charge, and so he was looked upon very highly, and one could understand why. Uh, Kennedy was too. Yes, and then he was assassinated. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Correct. And one can see why on this very significant thing that changes this way that has been on for so long. But anyhow, though Keeble urged Bowser to overlook this indignity, Bowser refused, packed up, and returned to Louisville. Bowser encouraged others not to support the school, and it closed 6 weeks after he left. Sure. Well, no. That, yeah, that seems, is willing to go along with things, and all of a sudden that's just one step way too far. Well, sure, no question. And as we look at it, it's just like so sad, and we're like shocked, and we're like, how can this be? And yet it kind of was. And again, I'm not saying there's not right and wrong and things like that, but if we were in those times, in those places, we would have been profoundly influenced by the culture also, and affected. That doesn't mean everybody's going along with it, and yeah, and, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless. And so that's kind of interesting. According to Wes Crawford, Bowser rejected once and for all the paternalism which had become so common. And again, we say in our churches of Christ, but it was kind of across the board at the time, and began to rely instead on independent African American leadership. Wes Crawford argues that this event signaled the birth of the independent tradition of the Churches of Christ. In the late 30s, Bowser had urged black members to send money to his black-led school instead of NCI. Bowser's students founded the present-day Southwestern Christian College in Terrell, Texas, and it's still there, and we'll talk more about that later, in 1950 to serve black Churches of Christ. This independent tradition began a new era when Jack Evans became the first president of Southwestern Christian College in 1967. And so I remember when Lee was here and we went to North Hills for I think it was North Hills, maybe it was Ferguson Heights, for a significant kind of gathering, and Lee would have to correct me on that, but I thought Jack Evans was there. I thought, and it was some dispute was going on, and I remember Lee saying he's tall timber in the Black Churches of Christ. Tall timber is what Lee said, and I just kind of remember that. But anyhow, Bowser also was a capable editor, and in 1902 he launched the Christian Echo, which was a public periodical like Firm Foundation, Gospel Advocate, within the black churches, and a publication that served to unify and mobilize black Churches of Christ for the remainder of the century. Throughout the civil rights struggle of the 60s and beyond, R.N. Hogan, one of Bowser's students at Silver Point Christian Institute, edited the Echo and made it the principal voice of black protest within Churches of Christ. Annie C. Tuggle story reveals a great deal about black Churches of Christ's identity formation and interaction of the accommodation and protest traditions. Tuggle served as a missionary, educator, and historian. While attending Bowser's Silver Point Christian Institute in 1913, she became a field agent for the school, raising funds throughout Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi. In the 1940s, Bowser commissioned her to serve in a similar capacity on behalf of his Bowser Christian Institute in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Before moving to Detroit in 1944, she taught in the NCI and presided over by Keeble. Despite these obvious differences between Bowser and Keeble, way of navigating all this, both contributed to a cohesive pattern of development of black Churches of Christ in the United States. Now, Tuggle's a really interesting figure because she wrote in her, I think, an autobiography. It was published in the 60s. And for a long time, it was the major history of the black Churches of Christ in her autobiography that was used. And so a very, very influential figure. Following several years of missionary activity in Jamaica, Bahamas, and Haiti, Tuggle compiled and published the first directory of African American Churches of Christ, which she titled Our Ministers and Song Leaders of the Churches of Christ, drawing in her rich store of personal experience within this tradition. And as I said, Tuggle published in 1973 her not the 60s, 73, her autobiography, Another World Wonder, which effectively served as a history of the black churches for most of the 20th century. So in other words, the history of black churches wasn't focused on or covered until obviously more recent times as having that significance and importance in itself. And so her book was used, and now there's been multiple books, some of which are on your bibliography. Her autobiography is not, because I hadn't read it. So that's why I didn't have it on there. But I believe you can still go to Amazon and get that, and I'm looking forward to reading it at some point. Black Churches of Christ nurtured a theological orientation as conservative as any within the white Churches of Christ. Now we're talking theology here. steeped in Campbellian rationalism, that way of looking at it that we've talked so much about. They long tended to be literalistic in the reading of biblical text and exclusivistic in attitudes toward other Christian traditions. In other words, those qualities the black churches tended to keep and latch on, and even today are more so than many of the white churches have kind of moved on from that view. Not all of ours, but many. And where in the black churches, they tend to be a little hang on to that way of looking at things. So just a point there. Likewise, the worship style is far more subdued and controlled than that of most other black Christian traditions. In other words, whereas black churches of Christ may tend to be a little more participatory than white churches were, they weren't the Pentecostals, for example. They were more subdued, is the point. Why? Because of the rationalistic way of looking at things. Now, I remember a guy once that was a strong Presbyterian fella. And do you know what they call themselves? The Frozen Chosen. Because they viewed themselves as being real intellectuals. The Presbyterians felt they were among the intellectual strains of Protestantism, and so the things of the mind, and less of that, and so kind of I don't know if a joke's the right term, but they would call themselves the Frozen Chosen because they didn't show much emotion, and so we've certainly at times in the past been categorized a little more like that, but nonetheless. And so Marshall Keeble underscored the dimension of black churches of Christ when he wrote that the gospel can take the dance out of the man, stop him from dancing, pull him out from under the mourner's bench, and set him up on a seat. In other words, he's saying, hey, that's a little too much activity, kind of coming from his point of view. But anyhow, yet to some extent, the conservatism of the black churches of Christ was cut from a different cloth than the white churches. So even though there was this very literal, very, very legal way of looking at things, Campbellian rationalism, for example, does not entirely explain the literalism from which black churches of Christ tend to approach Scripture. Another important factor has been the degree in which African Americans have understood a literal reading of Scripture to speak directly and powerfully to their experience. As Dwayne, yes, Bill. Well, for example, in the Old Testament, the ideas of Exodus and so on and so forth resonated greatly among black Christians, and for obvious reasons. We're slaves here. They were slaves. Where is our deliverer? Where is, so on and so forth. And so a view that was going to be so in a physical, real way, and not just in a privatized way of the mind, if you will. That's just one example. Yes.
I'm probably the only one in here that actually grew up in a black church, right? the only one. But the literalism I remember distinctly. If it was in the Bible, that is exactly, they took everything to word. Everything. My grandmother, my parents, everything you said and did took a direct translation, whether or not it was something that was meant to be just a teaching advice. They took everything pretty literally. And it was kind of a little bit different growing up that way, because anything and everything you did was considered a sin.
Yeah.
Unless it
Sin or not sin, right?
yeah, it was just it was completely black and white. There was no anything in between. And that it tended to be a little bit. It made things difficult because you didn't want to be
exclusiveness.
that is, the exclusiveness.
Yes.
Because for the longest time, I remember this believing that only if you did exactly what the Bible said, and you went to the Church of Christ, you were the only group that would ever, ever, ever get into Christianity.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
We strongly believe that. So you had to follow it bit by bit.
Well, and that was in the White Church of Christ too.
Yeah,
You know, for a long time.
So it was. I'm just sitting here looking at all this. Remember all that? 'Cause I was a child.
Were you all? You could only wear dresses.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah. No.
No, cannot. No. We all wore dresses all the time. There was no.
No slacks.
No slacks.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
No slacks at all. No slacks at all. The women had their place.
And,
The men did all the running of the church.
yeah. Would you say that is prevalent?
Still today,
Yeah,
in a lot of yes.
quite a lot.
The church my mother and sister belonged to, very much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I didn't. I'm just trying to think of the best way to say this. Sometimes when you move away from home and you move away, you go to college, and
You get other experiences.
you get other experiences, and I think when I left, like I said, I went to several trips to Christ. I mean, I grew up in Ron, and then when I was in college, I was in Ron. So you get different perspectives. And the first time that I went to into Christian church, that was right after college.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd never kind of gone anything other than a black church. And a lot of it had to do with where you live. I mean,
Yeah.
it was,
Sure.
yeah, it was the local church right there. You could get to it, so it was easy.
Yeah.
But when I went to the first time I ever went to an integrated church, and there was a white preacher, which I had never really seen before. I knew they were out there. I never
Yeah.
seen them. But the whole approach was completely different. The whole approach was completely, even though they were teaching the same lessons, everything, but the whole approach was completely different. And some of the things weren't as strict, literally strict,
Yeah. Yeah.
as it was where I grew up. I'm just looking at this one.
And so, the more we're exposed to other things, thank you for sharing all that. That's really, really great. Sure. Yeah. Well, and this, as we're in the 60s, this was a time, not just in civil rights, and we're going to cover kind of the theological way of looking at things, how that changed too, and go into quite a bit of detail. So this was a time of tremendous change that was going on, and it's really hard. Yeah, there was, yeah. Sure. Well, because that was much more widespread in thinking and understanding, and at that time, and so and so much change was going on, and as people, how do we process that change? It's really hard because what do we? Sure, people, and so that whole challenge that, wow, that's different than I thought, instead of, okay, that's different. No, that must be wrong because it's different. And so instead of trying to understand why they thought that way or how they came to those understandings, and you put that down. And that, of course, was again, that's not unique to this. And so anyhow, just very challenging in all these things. We'll look more. As Dwayne Winrow pointed out, the White Church of Christ, for the most part, values the 19th century historical critique methods, which suggests that in order to read and understand the Bible or any literary work properly, one must abandon oneself completely to the world of the literary work. In other words, we shouldn't look into it with our own experiences. What did they look at and understand? In particular, one must renounce one's experience of reality and suspends one's understanding of life and waive one's right to one's own values so that one may, without encumbrances, surrender oneself to the experiences, worldviews, values, and assumptions embedded into the work. Now, that's really complex, what was said, but basically what it is with this is this. In other words, should our experiences and the things that we've seen and so on just be tossed aside completely, or are those things, should that be used and understood? And so in other words, hey, you need to become a Christian. Forget about all this stuff going on out here. Forget about that you can't vote or do this or whatever. Forget all that. You need to just come to Christ. And let's get that right. And so that's kind of what that's talking about, at least in one example. In other words, are there these broader, larger things? And so in the black experience, hey, I can't ignore this because it's happening to me. Maybe to you it doesn't, it isn't so much of a big deal because you're not the end of it, so to speak. But rather, and so that's kind of the struggle that's going on here. Instead, blacks in Churches of Christ take the Bible both literally and authoritatively because they understand it to speak directly to the issues of slavery, racism, oppression, economic deprivation that have experienced in the United States. Some leaders continue today advocating for this contextual approach to hermeneutics, influenced especially by black liberation theology. And we'll talk about that next week. But this is why, an example of this is that why if you listen to the things that, the speeches of Martin Luther King, which most of us have been exposed to, and things like that, so many of the examples he would refer to Moses. They would have these biblical references. Well, that's that connection with that literalist, but more so kind of way of looking at it, and so drawing those connections. Well, this understanding, as with most things, can go further. And you know what happens. You remember we kept saying why in our bylaws it said you can't have premillennial thinking here, and that was always kind of, at least in the beginning, like, what's going on here? Well, in other words, if there's something we see that isn't right, what do we often do as people? We don't just move over here and kind of correct it. We want to go way over here to get as far away from that as we can, without realizing that maybe that isn't correct either, because we've gone so far this way to get away from that. And so, sometimes that works in it. So the point is, it's complicated. And it's always been complicated. It's still true. Well, but it is. It's not simplistic. So we will stop here. And next time we will try to talk a little bit about black liberation theology. Not that this is central, the major thing, but just as we've referenced it, and we've probably heard that terminology before, some of it. And so I just want to explain that in context of what we're talking about. Thank you very much. Rosalind, thank you for sharing all that.